On March 15th, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar, the man who had risen to godlike power, fell in a pool of his own blood, stabbed 23 times by those closest to him, his fellow senators. But what seemed like a righteous act of rebellion was the spark that set Rome ablaze with a thirst for vengeance. The men who believed they were liberators never anticipated the storm that would follow. They had killed a tyrant, they thought, and in doing so, they believed they had saved the Republic. But in reality, they had unleashed an unstoppable wave of retribution that would eventually claim each of their lives. As Caesar's blood soaked the Senate floor, Rome's revenge began. The assassins, once celebrated as heroes, soon found themselves hunted like dogs. Each man, from the brains behind the plot to the most reluctant participant, would face a cruel and poetic end. But their deaths weren't just about justice, they were a warning. Rome's vengeance wasn't merely about punishing murderers, it was about restoring the balance of power. And for every stab they made in Caesar's back, Rome would return with a dagger of its own. The Ides of March, 44 BCE, began like any other day in Rome, with the bustling streets filled with merchants, citizens, and soldiers going about their routines. Yet beneath the surface of everyday life, an undercurrent of tension had been building for months. Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the man who had crossed the Rubicon, the man who had become the face of Rome's power, was about to face the greatest threat of all, betrayal from those who were closest to him. In the Senate that day, the air was thick with anticipation. Caesar had been invited to speak at a meeting where his presence had long been expected. What he didn't know, however, was that the very men who greeted him, who had once broken bread with him and celebrated his triumphs, were preparing to strike a fatal blow to the heart of the Roman Republic. The conspirators were led by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, both of whom had once been trusted allies of Caesar. Cassius, a general with deep grudges against Caesar's growing power, had long viewed the Roman leader as a threat to his own political ambitions. His resentment had been brewing for years. Brutus, on the other hand, was a man torn by loyalty and betrayal. He was Caesar's adopted son, a figure whom Caesar had treated like his own flesh and blood. But for Brutus, the idea of Rome's survival and the preservation of its republic meant more than any family ties. His heart, torn by ideals of liberty and duty, led him to a fateful decision that would shatter his relationship with the man who had given him a future. The plot had been carefully planned, months in the making, a web of secrecy that spread throughout the highest echelons of Roman society. Senators who once basked in Caesar's favor had now turned against him, believing that the Republic could only survive if Caesar was removed from power. The moment had arrived. As Caesar entered the Senate chamber, he had no idea what awaited him. The conspirators surrounded him, each one ready to strike. The mood was tense, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of the decision they were about to make. And then, in a moment that would go down in history, the first dagger was thrust into Caesar's side. Casca, one of the senators, made the initial blow, a swift thrust into the back of the Roman leader. Caesar, feeling the first wave of pain, turned to face his attacker, only to see the faces of more senators, once his trusted allies, now revealed as his enemies. The room erupted into chaos. Caesar, staggered by the force of the first blow, tried to defend himself, but the weight of the attack was too much. The conspirators pressed on, stabbing him one by one, 23 times in total. Each dagger wound was a message, a symbol of their belief that Caesar's rise had become too great for Rome to endure. They saw themselves as protectors of the Republic, restoring what they believed to be the true essence of Roman virtue, freedom from tyranny. But the reality of their actions was far more complicated than they ever anticipated. Amid the violent struggle, Caesar's famed words, "Et tu, Brute," would echo through history. The shock of Brutus's betrayal was a blow far worse than any physical wound. Here was the man he had mentored, the son he had never had, the one person who had stood by his side through the trials of war, now turned against him. Brutus's participation in the assassination would forever stain their relationship, and his name would be eternally linked with treachery. As Caesar collapsed to the marble floor, his lifeblood slowly pooling beneath him, it wasn't just the death of one man. It was the death of an era. Caesar's last moments were filled with confusion and betrayal. The Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, had transformed into a chamber of bloodlust. The conspirators, who had so meticulously planned the murder, failed to realize the full extent of the storm they were about to unleash. Caesar, despite his many flaws, had been the embodiment of Roman power. His death would not restore the Republic as they believed. It would destroy it. The streets of Rome would soon be filled with chaos, and a new kind of leader would rise from the ashes of Caesar's blood-soaked legacy. In that moment, as Caesar's body lay lifeless on the cold marble floor, the world changed. The murder of the dictator was supposed to be the turning point in Roman history, the moment when the Republic was saved. But in reality, it was the beginning of a new, more violent chapter in Rome's story, a chapter written in blood, revenge, and the unchecked ambition of men who had no idea what they had unleashed. The Senate chamber, once a place of political debate and power, was now a scene of murder and chaos. Julius Caesar lay dead, his lifeblood slowly seeping into the cold marble floor, the very floor where he had once stood as the supreme ruler of Rome. The senators, breathing heavily, their hands stained with his blood, looked around in shock and disbelief. In their minds, they had done it. They had rid Rome of a tyrant, restored the Republic, and secured the future of the Roman people. But the reality of their actions was far more complex, and they were about to learn that the price of their betrayal would be far higher than they could have imagined. As they left the Senate, their minds filled with a false sense of triumph. They expected the streets of Rome to erupt in celebration. They had freed the people from the clutches of Caesar's autocracy, they thought. The people of Rome would pour into the streets, singing their praises, thanking them for restoring the Republic. After all, was it not the duty of every Roman citizen to protect their beloved city from the rise of a king? But when the conspirators stepped out of the Senate and into the daylight, they were met with silence. A deafening, unnerving silence. The streets were empty, the crowds nowhere to be seen. This silence was the first hint of the deep uncertainty that now gripped the Roman people. They had been so sure that they would be hailed as heroes, but the truth was that the people of Rome were terrified. They had lived under Caesar's rule, yes, but they had also enjoyed the stability he had brought to a fractured empire. The bread he had distributed, the victories he had won, the peace he had brokered. All of that had mattered far more to the average Roman than any abstract ideal of liberty or the Republic. Caesar, for all his faults, had given them something they could touch, something they could feel: security. The conspirators, blind to this reality, continued their march through the city, fully expecting to be hailed as saviors. They had misjudged the people. Caesar's death was not their victory, it was their first step toward damnation. The mob did not cheer for their liberation. Instead, they feared the future, unsure of what would come next. Would there be another leader to take Caesar's place? Would Rome be plunged into chaos? And, more importantly, who would fill the power vacuum that had now been created? As the days passed, the conspirators began to realize that their actions had not brought the freedom they had so longed for. Instead of rising in popularity, they were beginning to feel the heat of Rome's fear and anger. The once loyal senators were now viewed as enemies of the people. They had not restored the Republic, they had destroyed it. The realization of their mistake began to weigh heavily on them, but it was too late to turn back. Caesar's death had already set the stage for the chaos that was about to engulf Rome. Meanwhile, in the heart of the city, one man saw this moment of chaos as an opportunity. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's most trusted ally and the consul of Rome, understood the power of the people better than any of the conspirators. He knew that the mob was not so easily swayed by ideals of the Republic or abstract notions of liberty. What they wanted was stability, and Caesar had provided that. Without him, the people were vulnerable to the whims of whoever could control them, and Marcus Antonius, ever the shrewd politician, was ready to step into that void. While the conspirators were content to celebrate their bloody victory, Antonius saw what they had overlooked. The power of the people lay in their attachment to Caesar. It was not loyalty to the idea of the Republic that would unite Rome. It was loyalty to the man they had once called their emperor. Antonius quickly moved to seize the narrative, to frame Caesar's assassination as an act of murder rather than liberation. The first step in this process was to speak at Caesar's funeral. On the day of Caesar's funeral, the conspirators made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the power of public sentiment, and now they would pay the price. Brutus, with his cold logic and stoic demeanor, was the first to speak. He delivered a speech to the assembled crowd, attempting to justify Caesar's death with lofty rhetoric about the preservation of the Republic. He spoke of honor, of duty, and of the greater good, but the people were not moved. The idealistic words of Brutus fell on deaf ears. The crowd's loyalty to Caesar was too strong, their love for him too deep. Then it was Marcus Antonius's turn. Unlike Brutus, Antonius did not speak in abstract terms or lofty ideals. He spoke from the heart, and he spoke with passion. He did not condemn the conspirators outright, but he made one key move. He read aloud Caesar's will. It was a master stroke. The will revealed that Caesar had left his private gardens to the people of Rome, to be turned into public parks. He had also bequeathed 75 drachmas to every Roman citizen. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. A roar went up from the masses. The idea of Caesar's generosity, his love for the people, struck them deeply. The idea that they had been betrayed by the men who had assassinated him stung even harder. As Antonius's speech concluded, the mob's mood had changed. The sense of betrayal was palpable. They no longer saw Caesar as a tyrant. They saw him as a hero, a benefactor, a man who had cared for them. The conspirators, who had thought they had liberated Rome, now found themselves at the mercy of the very people they had sought to save. The power of public sentiment was undeniable, and it was turning against them. The Romans, now angry and filled with a thirst for justice, began to chant for the deaths of the conspirators. As the streets of Rome began to fill with the angry cries of the people, the conspirators realized their position was no longer secure. What they had hoped would be a triumphant day of liberation had turned into a nightmare. The masses, instead of cheering for their actions, were now clamoring for revenge. The conspiracy had not restored the Republic as they had envisioned, but had instead set the stage for an irreversible chain of events. The Republic they had sworn to protect was on the brink of collapse, and the future of Rome was no longer in their hands. It was in the hands of those who had the power to manipulate the public, the people who could turn the tide with their words, with their promises. In the midst of this chaos stood a young man whose name had not yet carried the weight it would in the coming years. Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus, had been absent from Rome when Caesar was assassinated. He was still a teenager, not yet the man who would go on to become the first emperor of Rome. But Caesar's assassination had changed everything. It had thrust Octavian into a role he had never anticipated, one of vengeance, power, and the will to reshape the destiny of Rome. Octavian was Caesar's adopted son, and upon Caesar's death, he was named as the heir to his fortune and his legacy. It was a will that would not just leave Octavian with wealth, but with the strength of Caesar's name, a name that resonated with the people of Rome and with the legions that had fought under Caesar's banner. The moment Caesar's will was read aloud in the Senate and to the people, it was clear that Octavian had inherited more than just material wealth. He had inherited a cause, a movement, and a public sentiment that could not be ignored. The conspirators had miscalculated in every way possible. They had thought that Caesar's death would eliminate a threat to the Republic, but what they had failed to understand was that Caesar had already created something much bigger than himself. He had created a movement, a loyal following that would not simply disappear with his death. They had killed a man, yes, but they had also fueled a legacy, and they had given birth to an even more dangerous force: Octavian. Octavian's immediate response to Caesar's death was calculated and cold. He returned to Rome, where his first step was to gather support among the people and the military. Though he was young and inexperienced, he was clever and ruthless. He knew that the conspirators, who had assumed the role of protectors of the Republic, were now seen as traitors by the Roman public. The loyalty of the legions, so firmly tied to Caesar, could be swayed. Octavian understood that power would not be won through rhetoric alone, but through control of the military, the true backbone of Roman politics. He began to form alliances with the very people who had once been Caesar's enemies, offering them power and influence in exchange for their support. His main rival for control of Rome, Marcus Antonius, Caesar's loyal general, saw the potential in Octavian and quickly aligned himself with him. Together, they began to consolidate power, not only in Rome, but throughout the Roman Empire. What followed was a series of political maneuverings and military confrontations that would lead to one of the most bloody and consequential civil wars in Roman history. Meanwhile, the conspirators, unaware of the storm they had unleashed, tried to maintain their grip on power. They had hoped that the Senate would back them in their vision for a restored republic, but that hope was quickly dashed. The Senate was a fragmented institution, and it could no longer serve as the center of political power it once had been. The death of Caesar had created a power vacuum, and now there were many contenders for the throne. The conspirators, who had once been the guardians of the Senate, found themselves surrounded by enemies on all sides: Octavian, Antonius, and even some of Caesar's former supporters who sought vengeance for the death of their leader. The conspirators underestimated the fury of the people and the ability of Octavian to manipulate the situation to his advantage. In the days and weeks following Caesar's assassination, Octavian was able to turn the tables. His position grew stronger, his alliances with the military more solidified. He quickly became the symbol of Caesar's vengeance, the rightful heir to the power and legacy that Caesar had left behind. As the conspirators hid in the shadows, fearing for their lives, Octavian was rising to take control of the empire. But this was not just about politics. This was not just about who would rule Rome. This was a fight for the soul of Rome itself. The murder of Caesar had not only sparked a political crisis, it had sparked a civil war, one that would consume the Roman Republic from within. It was a war of ideals, a war between those who sought to preserve the ancient ways of the Republic and those who believed that Rome's future could only be secured through the consolidation of power in the hands of a single ruler. And in this war, there would be no easy victories, no compromises. The bloodshed would be immense, the stakes higher than ever before. As Octavian and Antonius gathered their forces, the conspirators knew that their time was running out. They had made their bed, and now they would have to lie in it. The age of the Republic was coming to an end. The civil war that followed would be the final nail in the coffin of Rome's former glory. And for the men who had struck the fatal blows against Caesar, it was only a matter of time before the consequences of their actions would come crashing down on them. The conspirators, once hailed as the saviors of Rome, soon found themselves ensnared by the very ideals they had used to justify Caesar's murder. Their belief in the restoration of the Republic quickly turned to dust as Rome descended into a bloody civil war. The political machinations that had seemed so promising in the Senate now seemed hollow, and the conspirators' bold plan had begun to unravel. What they had failed to comprehend was that they had not liberated Rome. They had only ignited a powder keg that would consume them all. After the assassination, the conspirators made their way to the capital, expecting the Senate to embrace them as heroes, the very liberators who had freed the Republic from the threat of a king. They believed that their actions would lead to a resurgence of Roman virtue, a return to the old ways of the Republic, where power was shared and the will of the people reigned supreme. But they quickly realized that their dream of a restored Republic was nothing more than an illusion. The Senate, long undermined by corruption and greed, could not serve as the bastion of Roman ideals they had hoped, and the people of Rome, instead of celebrating their triumph, were now gripped by fear and uncertainty. The first mistake of the conspirators was their underestimation of the power of Caesar's name. Julius Caesar had not simply been a man, he had been a force. His name was synonymous with power, victory, and Roman greatness. When he died, it was not just the end of a political career, it was the end of an era. The idea of Caesar lived on in the hearts of the Roman people, and they were not ready to part with him. The conspirators, despite their lofty ideals, had severed the head of a movement, and in doing so, they had created a vacuum of power that only chaos could fill. This was the moment when Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, began to rise. At the time of Caesar's assassination, Octavian was little more than a teenager, a young man with no military experience and no true political power to speak of. Yet, with the reading of Caesar's will, Octavian inherited not just wealth, but a legacy. More importantly, he inherited the loyalty of Caesar's legions, the men who had fought and bled alongside Caesar in Gaul, in Egypt, and on the battlefields of Rome. The loyalty of these men was not to the abstract ideals of the Republic. It was to Caesar, the man who had made them mighty. Octavian understood this. He understood that Caesar's death had left behind a power greater than any Senate decree could ever hope to restore. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's closest ally, quickly realized that Octavian was a force to be reckoned with. He had once been a trusted general in Caesar's army, and now, in the wake of Caesar's murder, he saw an opportunity to secure his own place in the power vacuum that had been created. Together, Antonius and Octavian formed an uneasy alliance, one forged not out of friendship but necessity. Their goal was singular: to avenge Caesar and eliminate the conspirators who had dared to kill him. In the meantime, Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, remained holed up in Rome, attempting to hold on to whatever power they could muster. They believed that the people would come to their side, that their actions would be seen as a righteous stand against a would-be tyrant. But as time passed, it became clear that they had misjudged the situation gravely. The public turned against them, seeing them not as liberators, but as traitors. And their failure to account for the loyalty of Caesar's soldiers, combined with the growing political power of Octavian and Antonius, left them isolated and vulnerable. The conspirators, desperate to maintain control, attempted to rally support by offering amnesty to anyone who had participated in Caesar's murder, hoping that they could consolidate power and defend the Republic from those who sought to dismantle it. But the reality was far harsher than they had imagined. As the conspirators sought refuge in the halls of the Senate, they realized that they were no longer the respected senators they once were. Their names had become synonymous with betrayal, their faces now forever marked by the blood they had spilled. They had underestimated the fury of Rome's masses, and they had miscalculated their ability to maintain power through force of will alone. The crucial turning point came when the Senate granted Brutus and Cassius amnesty, allowing them to return to their positions of power in Rome. But this forgiveness was hollow, a mere temporary reprieve. The conspirators were still hunted men, marked for death by Octavian and Antonius, who had no intention of allowing them to live in peace. They may have won a brief political victory, but the cost was high. Every moment they spent in Rome brought them closer to their ultimate reckoning, and that reckoning came swiftly. As Octavian and Antonius consolidated their power, the Senate became increasingly irrelevant. The political and military tides were turning against Brutus and Cassius. The men who had once believed they were doing what was best for Rome were now outcasts, their fate sealed by their actions. Their military campaign against Octavian and Antonius was a desperate attempt to cling to power, but it was clear from the beginning that they were outmatched. They had no popular support, no powerful allies, and no real hope of victory. Their forces were scattered, and the armies of Octavian and Antonius were too strong to overcome. It was not long before Brutus and Cassius were forced into battle, their final stand coming in the decisive Battle of Philippi. The fight was a bloody one, but it ended with disaster for the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius, their forces shattered and their hopes dashed, were left to face the consequences of their actions. The very men they had betrayed were now their executioners, and the price for their crime was the ultimate one. They had killed Caesar in the name of saving the Republic, but in the end, it was the death of the Republic that came with their own deaths. The final chapter for the men who killed Julius Caesar was written not in the grand halls of the Senate, but in the bloody trenches of battle, in the cold reality of their betrayal. The ghosts of their actions haunted them at every step, driving them to their last stand. Their failure was not just political, it was existential. They had sought to preserve the Republic, to save Rome from the tyranny they believed Caesar would impose. But in their quest for freedom from a king, they had unwittingly paved the way for the rise of an emperor. Rome's fate was sealed, and there was no turning back. After the defeat at the Battle of Philippi, it was clear that the conspirators' hopes were shattered beyond repair. Brutus and Cassius, the masterminds behind Caesar's assassination, found themselves caught between a hostile army and a people who had turned against them. Their military defeat was inevitable. Their forces were shattered, their political influence non-existent, and their alliances had crumbled. They had underestimated the loyalty of Caesar's legions and the power of his legacy, a mistake that would cost them everything. Brutus, a man once known for his noble ideals, found himself confronted by a brutal reality. His attempt to justify Caesar's murder as an act of patriotism, as a necessary evil to preserve the Republic, had failed miserably. The people did not see him as a liberator. They saw him as a murderer, a betrayer of the very ideals he claimed to uphold. In the end, Brutus's downfall was not just the result of his military defeat, but of the crushing weight of his own conscience. He had never fully reconciled the act of killing Caesar with his love for Rome, but in his desperation and disillusionment, he had made a fatal choice. When the final blows were struck at Philippi, Brutus's army was in retreat, and it became clear that the battle was lost. He and Cassius, once the most powerful men in Rome, were now fugitives, their dreams of restoring the Republic forever dashed. The two men, who had been so sure of their righteousness, were left to face the consequences of their actions. It was in these final moments of failure that Brutus, overwhelmed by the enormity of his betrayal and the collapse of the cause he had fought for, made a decision that would forever seal his fate. In one of the most tragic moments of Roman history, Brutus took his own life. It was a death marked not by honor or triumph, but by the bitter realization that his entire life's work had been for nothing. He had sought to free Rome from a tyrant, but in doing so, he had become the architect of its destruction. His death was the death of the Republic itself, a republic that had crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions and the ambitions of men who believed they could change the course of history by killing a man. In the end, Brutus, the last of the great Republican idealists, succumbed to the very ideals that had driven him to murder Caesar. His life and death became a testament to the futility of his cause and the inevitable rise of the empire. Cassius, too, faced the same grim fate. After the defeat at Philippi, his life, once filled with power and influence, slipped into obscurity. The man who had been so influential in bringing Caesar's death to fruition found himself alone, his political career over, his military power destroyed. The weight of his own betrayal became too much for him to bear. In the face of Octavian's growing power and the crushing realization that his cause was lost, Cassius chose to end his life. His death, like Brutus's, was not a hero's end, but a tragic and pointless conclusion to a life spent in the pursuit of a republic that no longer existed. He had been a man of action, a man of steel, but in the end, he was a man undone by his own choices. The death of Brutus and Cassius marked the end of the old order. The republic they had fought for, and ultimately destroyed, was gone, its ideals lost to the winds of history. Rome was no longer a republic, governed by elected officials and the will of the people. It was an empire, ruled by a single man, a man who had once been a boy, a man who had learned how to manipulate both the people and the military to gain power. That man was Octavian, later to be known as Augustus. With the conspirators dead, Octavian's victory was complete. He had avenged his adoptive father's murder and had eliminated the last vestiges of the old republican order. Rome's transition from republic to empire was now inevitable. Octavian had achieved what no other Roman leader had. He had brought peace to a fractured empire, but at the cost of the republic's ideals. Augustus would reign for over 4 decades, establishing the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability that allowed the Roman Empire to flourish for centuries. But beneath the surface of this peace lay the quiet certainty that Rome's former glory, its commitment to shared power and civic responsibility, was now lost forever. In the years that followed, Augustus would rule not as a dictator, but as the first Roman emperor. His reign would be one of absolute control, though he maintained the illusion of a restored republic. The Senate, though still in existence, was now a puppet body, its power effectively neutered. The people of Rome, once the masters of their own fate, now found themselves subjects of an empire that was ruled by one man and his ever-growing family. The conspirators had murdered Caesar in the name of saving the Republic, but in doing so, they had sown the seeds of its destruction. Their deaths, like their lives, were marked by tragic irony. In trying to preserve the ideals of freedom and democracy, they had brought about the very tyranny they had feared. And in their final moments, as they fell in battle or took their own lives, they must have realized that their fight was never about the Republic at all. It was about power, ambition, and a legacy that could never be reclaimed.